Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of May 8th, 2025. We are coming to you this week, as always, from the Crow's Nest here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House, overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest this week is author Robert Edsel, who joins me to talk about his new book on World War II, particularly the extraordinary story of the American cemetery in Margraten in the Netherlands. Robert Edsel is recognized as one of the world's foremost advocates for art preservation and the recovery of cultural treasures missing since World War II. The last 20 years of his life have been dedicated to the meticulous research of the monuments men and women, the soldier scholars who helped save so many of the world's great art and cultural treasures from the destruction of war and theft by the Nazis. Previously, Robert had a successful 16-year career as founder and chairman of Gemini Exploration, an oil and gas exploration company. Robert has been honored with the Texas Medal of the Arts, the President's Call to Service Award, the Hope for Humanity Award presented by the Dallas Holocaust Museum, and the Foundation for the National Archives Records of Achievement Award. In 2022, the United States Army and the Smithsonian Institution made Robert an honorary graduate of the first Army Monuments Officer Training Program. Robert is also the founder and chairman of the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, recipient of the National Humanities Medal awarded by President George W. Bush. He is the author of 5 books, including Rescuing Da Vinci, published by Laurel Publishing in 2006, The Monuments Men, Allied Heroes, Nazi Thieves, and The Greatest Treasure Hunt in History, published by Center Street in 2009, which served as the basis for the 2014 film directed by and starring George Clooney. Saving Italy, The Race to Rescue a Nation's Treasures from the Nazis, published by W. W. Norton in 2013, The Greatest Treasure Hunt in History, The Story of the Monuments Men, published by Scholastic Focus in 2019. And finally, the one he's here to talk about with me today, entitled Remember Us, American Sacrifice, Dutch Freedom, and a Forever Promise Forged in World War II, published on April 29th by Harper Horizon. Telling the stories of the individuals who are buried at Margraten in the American Netherlands Cemetery, I think humanizes the global conflict that was World War II in a way that most histories of this scale simply don't do. It brings into sharp focus the trauma of the families left behind and the deep wounds that the war inflicted even on those who never saw combat. More than anything, I think it emphasizes how much we owe to those who fought that war so far from home for something that was a great deal bigger than them. It's a very moving book, and I am very pleased to have Robert Edsel join me on this podcast. My conversation with Robert Edsel begins now. Robert Edsel, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be with you.
You have written a remarkable book called Remember Us, American Sacrifice, Dutch Freedom, and a Forever Promise Forged in World War II. This is a gigantic story. It is ostensibly a story about a military cemetery in the Netherlands. It is a much, much bigger story than that, and I want you to talk about it. There's no way in 1 hour we're going to do justice to all the stories in this book and all the hard work you put into tracking down those stories. But tell us about how you were drawn to this and what the story of the Netherlands American Cemetery is all about.
I really look at myself less as an author than I do a messenger because, when you're going to give many years of your life, and I've spent 8 years of my life on this book and, 5 or 6 on Monuments Men at the beginning and then many years since then, for me at least, to make the sacrifice of those years, there's got to be a higher calling than just figuring out I've got to go sell some books. And I lament it's this way, but feature film is the most effective way to convey a message globally if you've got one. And in the case of the Monuments Men, I thought it was remarkable that at the time when I discovered it, 55 years after the most documented photographed event in history, World War II, there could be a major story about the war we didn't know. What role did art play with Hitler? How did these works of art survive the most destructive war in history? And most importantly for me, wasn't the bad guys, because there's always bad guys. Who were the people that saved this? What were they thinking? Why did they do this? How can one person make a difference? And I wanted to know their story. And the more I understood it, happened during the American-led invasion of Iraq. And I don't get into the issue of whether we should or shouldn't have done that. But my question is, if you're the invading force, what responsibility do you have to protect cultural treasures of the country you're in? And my answer is it's absolute. You're the new sheriff in town. And the fact that we didn't do that and we paid a horrible price in the view of the world and bad PR and stuff was not in this instance a case of us forgetting our history. We just didn't know it. So that's really what the motivation was, to encapsulate all this work, tell the story of the Monuments Men, have a foundation to preserve their legacy and put it to use. And happily now, all these years later, we got the film made. The Monuments Men and Women have received the Congressional Gold Medal, our nation's highest civilian honor. They got thanked for the first time in 2015. A permanent exhibition on their legacy at the National World War II Museum. And here 4 years ago, the Army reconstituted monuments officers for the first time in 80 years. It's crazy, but that's what happened. In this instance, I had fate tap me on the shoulder once again, driven by curiosity, but I'd been sent this photograph by the nephew of one of the monuments officers, the one monuments officer, American monuments officer killed during combat, Walter Hutchhausen, and he'd accepted an invitation to go to the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony, included a photo. And he said, "Hey, I just got back from London and I had a wonderful visit with Frida, and here's a photo." And I looked at this photo and I thought, Frida, Frida, Frida. I don't know any Fridas. And then it occurred to me the only Frida I know was that 19-year-old girl that lived near Maastricht in the Netherlands, who wrote Harvard trying to get the name and address of Walter Hutchhausen's mother so she could tell her that she's looking over his grave, and she walks 5 miles to go put flowers on it. And I thought, I never occurred to me that she was alive. Well, it probably wouldn't have mattered for Monuments Men. I had the letter and I put that in the Monuments Men book. But when I knew this, I thought, I need to go meet this woman. And my wife said, do you have some ambitions? And I said, like what? And she said, write a book. And I said, no, are you kidding? She's maybe the last person to have seen Hutchhausen before he was killed. I spent all my years of my life writing this story. I feel duty bound to go meet her and see what she had to say. And we became pen pals and exchanged a lot of letters before I met her. But I went and met her, and she starts telling me this story about the cemetery and all that took place. And then she said to me, "Do you know about the cemetery?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Do you know about the grave adoption program?" And I said, "The what? What are you talking about?" And I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe I didn't know about it and nobody had said anything to me. And that's where it began was, well, how did this happen? And how did these people that are out there on a battlefield, who helped them? Where did they go? Who took them somewhere? And I was stunned. I'm still amazed about how many Americans have no idea we have an overseas cemetery. Most of those that I know that have them, that know we have them, know that we have Normandy, but that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And Normandy's beautiful and scenic and historic. Nothing can take away from the majesty of that special place overlooking the beaches where so many boys lost their lives. But Margraten is the crown of the American Battle Monuments Commission overseas cemeteries, in my opinion, because unlike the other cemeteries, yes, there's somberness, but there's happiness, there's joy, there's youthfulness, because the Dutch people take their children and grandchildren out there, they take schools out there, and it's filled with life, celebrating these, at the time, 17,800 American, mostly boys and a few girls, who lost their lives in the war, our largest World War II cemetery at that point in time. And that to me is a transcendent moment.
Mm-hmm. So you tell the story of this cemetery and this remarkable adoption program that the Dutch instituted in this town. But really, you also you introduce us to a handful of people whose final resting place is in that cemetery, and a couple who are not buried there, but who are integral to the story. How did you go through the process of trying to figure out? Okay, there's 8,000 people who are still there. You mentioned 17,000, and about 50 some odd percent were brought back home at the request of families and loved ones in 1947, 48. But of those left behind, you tell some remarkable stories, and you take us really from the time almost there. I was going to say the boots hit the ground until they are put to rest there. But how did you choose these people, and what was it like trying to tell this story that had so many moving pieces and parts? It's a gigantic story, and you just wrapping your arms around all of it had to be quite a task.
Well, when people say, how could it take 8 years? There's my answer. I mean, it is an epic story.
How could you do it in
And
only 8 years? That's
yeah,
what I would ask you.
well, we looked, my military historian, Dr. Seth Givens, who's just a brilliant historian and loves these boys and the women that are buried there like I do. I mean, he has been so committed to this from the get-go. And we believed we had a duty, a sacred duty to get the facts right. And that meant extra work, double checking, and so on. So there are these things called independent deceased personnel files, IDPFs, and almost every soldier that was killed has them, although there was a horrific fire, as you know, in 1973 in St. Louis at the National Archives, and many were destroyed. And we found some of those. I mean, they put out the fire, and a lot of these files are singed and burned around the edges, and we found some like that. But we were looking for, we didn't want to go for the low-hanging fruit and figure, okay, well, there's 6 Medal of Honor recipients at the Netherlands American Cemetery in Margraten, which is only about 10 miles from the German border from the town of Aachen. I mean, this is where World War II in Western Europe starts. Hitler's got to cross the border with Netherlands, and he does it through Margraten and Maastricht to get to Belgium on his way to France. I mean, this is where it starts, May 10, 1940.
Mm-hmm.
And we start looking at these. We thought, we could do Medal of Honor recipients, but we weren't trying to do something dramatic like that. And then I thought, well, um, hero stories. People love hero stories. Well, yeah, we got 8,000 to look through. But then I thought, you know what we want to do? We want to remind Americans who we are. I want some of everything. We found a Native American who volunteered over the strongest objection of his mother, who said, all this country's ever done is stuff to us, not for us. But he was determined to volunteer because the land had been attacked. We wanted an American chaplain we found. Fantastic story. Twins who were both pilots, who at the time, absurd as this seems in hindsight, were allowed to fly in the same plane. We found a guy who was hero straight out of Hollywood casting, Robert Cole.
Hmm.
Handsome guy, square jaw, tough as John Wayne and then some. Should have been killed at on the D-Day drop and wasn't. He trained with Eisenhower's young officer. I mean, this guy's got everything you could ever dream of. I mean, you make a movie just around his heroic life and so on. I mean, a German Jew who'd immigrated to the United States and then put on American uniform and was an intelligence officer with one of the armies. A black tanker who was convinced anywhere other than where I'm from is going to be better than this. And then, of course, a black man from Dothan, Alabama, whose oldest memory when he was 6 years old was the crackling sound outside the shack he lived in, and he opened the panels to see a bunch of white hooded Ku Klux Klan guys with the burning cross who were there to hang his dad over the unpardonable sin of selling a bale of cotton because he needed to feed his family, and the cotton owner, the plantation owner, wouldn't sell. So he volunteered just to get out. His grandma had always told him, if you can ever get out, do it. And he lied about his age at 16 and a half, went into the army, and ends up as a quartermaster. And a chance, like the 442nd guys did, the Hawaiian Americans and Japanese Americans, a chance to prove, I'm just as worthy as a white soldier, only to find himself as a quartermaster troop being told by his CO, have the guys ready at 4 in the morning. We're moving out. Where are we going, sir? You'll find out when we get there. And they could hear the sounds of the axes and the shovels, but they could smell the smells. And they opened the tarp on the back of the transport truck to see the horror of horrors, that their job was to bury the dead or the parts of the dead that were being brought in from the battlefield on trucks. So it's rich characters. People should know not everybody dies. And you're not going to know till you're finished which ones make it and which ones don't.
Hmm.
I had one of the publishers that rejected it said, this book sounds depressing. And I said, really? How so? And they said, well, everybody dies. And I said, no, everybody doesn't die. And I said, you went to go see Titanic. Did you think that everyone's going to walk off that ship? And he said, well, that's different. There's a love story. And I said, several love stories in this book. It's as a great line from Lonesome Dove. It ain't dying I'm talking about, it's living. And I think one of the themes of this book is everybody, every human being wants to be remembered somehow, some way by somebody. And in that cemetery, even today, having given up 7,500 boys that were brought back, as you rightly say, there's 10,000 that are there today. There's someone from every single state of the United States, including District of Columbia, and they are buried with absolute democracy. White next to black, privates next to generals, women next to men, Jews next to Christians. It's an extraordinary place.
Hmm. And you begin with a poem by Archibald MacLeish, but the poem is called "The Young Dead Soldiers Do Not Speak." It was published in 1943. The tears began to flow just getting through that poem. "Remember us," it says, which is where you get your title. Remember us.
Our deaths are not ours, they are yours. They will mean what you make them.
Hmm.
We leave you our deaths, give them their meaning. That's the call from the grave. That's the
Hmm.
call of the ages of the people that bought and paid for the freedom that we enjoy today. That's their that's their cry out to us that make it count, make our lives and our losses, the lives we didn't get to live, the inventions we didn't get to invent. How
The
many
parents we didn't get to be.
yeah, how many Stephen Jobs are out there that we don't know about that invented things? How many great business managers? We don't know. So the tragedy is not just the loss of the lives of these boys, it's all those cumulative years of what might have happened had they not had this happen. And they still made the sacrifice. And their message for the ages is we did this so you don't have to. As our friend um, Ted Moore says, if I'm here serving, then that's one boy that doesn't have to. That was
Hmm.
a message of a soldier he knew in Vietnam. So, it's a powerful message. And the message is don't take that freedom for granted because we gave up a lot to make sure you had it.
And what you make clear is it's not just American freedom, but it's freedom for the Dutch. These people, as you must say, were overrun by the German army early in May of 1940, and for 4 years, 4 months, I forget how many days, but they lived under occupation, some of it brutal occupation that turned neighbor against neighbor. The deprivations of food and basic necessities they had to do without. And one of the most moving moments in the book to me was when one of these young people that you write about who lived in that town looked up and saw American airplanes or American paratroopers, I can't remember, been thought, and this is your point, they left freedom to come help us. Americans could sit there and say, we're not in danger. This isn't our fight, as so many people probably would today. We have no call to be there. These people should have defended themselves. They left warm homes with a lot of food and clothing and shelter and left young children and spouses and went to do this really, really, really dirty, difficult job. And you tell the story of the people living under the occupation and the people who liberated them. Talk a little bit about the two women who are at the heart of this story, two Dutch women, different ages, who are really the movers and shakers, the heart of this book, if you will.
Well, the two women, it's through the experience of the two women that I tell the story because they're the ones that held my hand through the process. One I knew for the last 8 years of her life, Frida van Skyke, so we call her Frida, who I delivered her eulogy. And Frida was a beautiful human being who was 15 when she lost her freedom when the Germans came rolling across the border in May 40. And she was 19 when she saw the first turret on an American tank. Her dad she was the youngest of six children, and her dad assigned her the task that usually befalls the youngest of a family, like do this, do that, go run this errand, go run that errand. And he kept telling her, go outside, see if they're here yet, because all the rumors were proliferating. And there was that eerie silence you often read about. And she'd go out and come back and say, I don't see anything, I don't hear anything. And this went on much of the day. And then she could feel the vibration and start to hear the sound of mechanized vehicles. And then the turret came over the hill. And she told me tearfully, as I'm sure, here's what she told me was tearfully, but she told me to this when she was 89 or 90, I think with the same sense of passion she did in 1944, in September 1944. Look, Poppy, these American boys have come all the way across the ocean to save us. And it just it brings such tears to my eyes to think that they were shocked that anyone could even have equipment like this. And where did they get this equipment from? And how did they get it all the way across the ocean? And there was they just couldn't understand it. And of course, they could have, and we did take that view in 1939 and 1940 and early part of 1941. It's like it's not our fight. We don't want to have to deal with it. We're safe, but we learned otherwise. And from that point in time, we Americans were there to not only solve somebody else's fight, but to make sure that we did the best we could do, a better job to protect our own country.
So Frida is a young girl going through this, and not far away in another town is another woman who is a mother and who just keeps on being a mother. I think you said she eventually ended up with 14 children, two of whom I think she took in after the war. But tell us about Emily.
Emily Mikkels van Kesnik is the wife of the mayor of Maastricht. So Maastricht's about 5 miles from where Frida's home is. But don't be deceived in the environment back then, it might as well have been in a different county. I mean, they didn't necessarily know what was going on in the big city of Maastricht, much less what was happening in the smaller town of Margraten, near where the cemetery was built. And Emily, her mother died giving birth to her. So she was raised by her dad and an uncle. So she's around guys all the time. And when she met her husband to be, he asked, what are your ambitions in life? And she said, I want to have a large family. And she said, what do you want to do? And he said, well, I want to be the mayor. I want to be a mayor. And he was really enamored with her. They were at a dance with chaperones. It's really sweet. And they got together again a few days later with their chaperones. And he said, I have a confession to make. And she asked what it is. And he said he's given a lot of thought to what his ambition was. And he's decided he wanted to have a large family also. So, this is the basis for a marriage that's a love affair till the day she dies. They end up having 12 children, eight before the war starts, three during the war, and one right after the war. And then they do adopt two Hungarian children whose parents are murdered by Soviet Red Army soldiers. So 14 in the house, and it's not a very big house. And Emily was a woman out of her time. She was very entrepreneurial in her attitude towards things. She knew how to get stuff done. She was skilled in knowing how to make things happen. And when they were liberated, um, by General Corlitt's troops, she said to General Corlitt, we can't ever repay the debt of gratitude for bringing our freedom back. If there's anything we could do to help, please tell me. And General Corlitt said, you know what? My guys on the front line are, in a difficult fight. They need to rest and get away. Maybe you could help organize some dances or something to just take their mind off of it for a few days so we can rotate guys off the front. And she said, done. And she put together this large group of women who were going to act as the chaperones, who knew girls in all the different provinces around there. And they got volunteers and they organized these dances, and they went off very, very successfully and were very helpful. And Emily, this is the stuff of researchers' dreams. Emily writes in these memory books, which were how she helped me tell the story from the grave, because she died in 1970. But these memory books that were part diary, part tipped in documents, photos, artifacts like Wrigley's spearmint chewing gum that she'd see some soldier toss on the ground. She had the presence of mind to pick it up and paste it into the book. But she said, I know no one in my family will ever read this. It's like, right there, you got me. Fantastic. I'm reading it, and I'm going to make sure other people read it. And she goes on to say, um, just how she said, because of the dance program, I one day realized that I wasn't just Mrs. Mayor. And it's beautiful because she's flowered as a human being and realizes she has skills besides just having the children, and she likes it. So she's very downcast when the war ends as to the fact that there's no reason to have dance programs anymore. In fact, they've become, superfluous, and she's trying to find a place to take this energy and to help. And General Simpson is a friend of their families, head of Ninth Army, and so is Leo Senecal, who really is kind of the de facto Army mayor for Maastricht. And when Senecal leaves in June, July of 45, he says to her, and I think he knew she needed a project. He says to her, maybe you could kind of watch over this nascent grave adoption program that's happening in Margraten. And Emily is the reason the program transforms itself from this small provincial program of people just doing the decent thing, a very organic origin, to having a more national, international presence, because when the army and government refused to provide the names and addresses of next of kin, Emily writes a letter to the chief executive officer of the United States of America, President Truman, and lays out the case. Of course, it dies bureaucratic death, but the courage and confidence to do this as a young woman of 37, 38, and then the things that she does afterwards in traveling the United States. These are epic decisions made, and they're such a beautiful example of a reasonably normal person doing incredibly extraordinary things and making a difference. And she changed things.
Hmm. It's an incredible story. She came to the United States on something of a tour to sort of get the word out that there were people there who would look after the graves of their loved ones. I want to talk about some of these individual American soldiers. We'll come back to that, but you've already mentioned this is grave adoption program. So, soldiers who are helping to liberate both Holland and Germany wind up in a cemetery in Margraten, a military cemetery of which there were many after the Allies landed in Normandy. How did this grave adoption thing begin?
Well, it happens organically. And again, I made the point earlier about how people in a community that's only 5 or 6 miles away might as well have been 30 miles away. There's no newspapers going around, it's all word of mouth. So, in the case of Frida, Frida knew a number of different soldiers, and um, that when they would pass through or while they were staying there, because General Simpson's army was basically stuck in this area for about 4 months, which is a very unusual experience for combat officers because they're on the move all the time. But here they are stuck, and we're an agrarian country. So you have these boys coming off the farms, seeing, what are they seeing? Farming communities, ranching communities, orchards everywhere, and people working with their hands. And that doesn't seem so foreign to them. They speak a different language, but there's a basis for people to be getting along. And the people there were so grateful to have their freedom. They open their homes or let the soldiers sleep out in the barn, and they get to know some of them, and friendships evolve. So I think where we're dealing with the different soldiers, their stories are so important, and we wanted to have this variety of stories, from Robert Cole, who's a combat soldier, to combat airborne paratrooper, to a chaplain who is in an Army transport group who never would have been drafted, but he volunteered. He wanted to go in. He realized there was a need. There was a massive shortage of chaplains at the beginning of the war, and he's not satisfied because he's not close enough to the front. He's not with the boys. How am I supposed to minister to them if they're either alive or dead? I mean, I need to be out there where they are. So he asks for a transfer and transfers into 17th Airborne and becomes a paratrooper himself. So he can be right there. I mean, another example of firemen running towards the fire, not running away from it, or just staying where you are. Down to, guy like Bill Hughes, who's a black tanker. He grows up in Indianapolis and is just convinced anywhere in the world is going to be less racism than in Indianapolis. And he works for a while in Washington, D.C. and pretty happy with that. But then he gets drafted and he finds out that there's a lot of other places that are as bad or worse. So each of them have a different experience that is the American experience. Some are beautiful, some are ugly, some are the ugly part of our history. And I think that it's important because we're not nobody's perfect. And we're so critical of people. Look, I mean, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, they had flaws too. And sometimes we treat them as we look back in history as if, well, the infraction that we can find 200 years later in our modern day view is so grave as to overshadow the epic contributions they've made to the development, not just of our country, but of civilization. We've lost perspective on that basis. So I saw a chance for people to be reminded about, everyone's got flaws, everyone's got mistakes, and who are we kidding? All 10,000 boys and the 4 women that are buried at Margraten today, they weren't all saints. I'm sure some of them we probably wouldn't like, but they answered the call and they risked it all and they gave their lives for something that the most precious gift that we've got as Americans. And we should focus on what they did accomplish and the good in their lives and not be looking for chinks in the armor because they're there for all of us. I mean, get a mirror before you start.
Yeah. Um, and really the grave adoption is a reflection of the immense gratitude that these people in Holland felt for these Americans who, as you said, had come so far, who had left freedom to come help deliver them from the clutches of this evil regime. And it just the gratitude was overwhelming. They got to know these boys, and then I'll tell you one of the painful things about reading this book is as you said, not everybody dies, and it's true. Not everybody does. You don't know that though. And as you're reading their stories, you like them, you're cheering for them, and you think to yourself, "Oh no, when is it coming?" And for some of them, it comes pretty quick, and some it comes late. I want to talk about a few of those now. I want you to tell us. I want to start with the Nortons, the Norton boys. What a story, and what tragic heartbreak.
It certainly is. Yeah, the Nortons. The what I wanted to make sure that we did was when that in telling the story about the individuals, and we mentioned a couple of them, Jeff Wiggins and Bill Hughes. I didn't want, to finish something, I want to figure out where you want to start.
Mm.
And I didn't want to end this book like everything else about World War II, that the war's over, we go home, it's over, because it's just beginning for so
Mm.
many millions of Americans. The
Yes.
500,000 that are killed, but then on average, each family's got 4 people in the family, and then you start multiplying that, and you're in the millions at that stage. I wanted people to know that story. I wanted to be the one to tell it. And I have the people to do it because I have Frida and I have Emily Mikkels van Kesnik and I have these people in Margraten that are helping with these earliest graves. So the Norton boys are on a fateful air mission, one that should never have been flown in May 1943, trying to knock out the coastal defenses of the Netherlands to allow American and British bombers to fly and start bombing Germany. And I say it shouldn't have been flown because they flew the exact same mission just a couple days earlier to catastrophic results and ineffective results. They were trying to bomb a submarine. Their particular squadron was trying to destroy a submarine pen that was just impenetrable. I mean, just as a giant blob of concrete that was the pins are embedded underneath it. I've seen aerial photos of it. It's like there's a lot of bomb craters all around it. They chipped a few areas, but didn't hardly make a dent. And through the kinds of things that happen in war, slightly off course here, there, equipment failure that results in a plane having to turn back and climbing too fast that triggers a German radar. I mean, just the errors that happen during war, the things that you can't train away, have them off course, and they are caught in just horrific flak, and it chews up the squadron. And these two boys, which have never been separated for a day in their life, have a really difficult time throughout this. And so that could be a story that, okay, that's nice, that's sweet, that's sad. There's thousands of sad stories, millions of sad stories. But the story doesn't end there with us. Now we're going to go and see, well, how did their father, a doctor, feel about this when he got the news that they were missing? How did his wife, their mother, react? What impact did it have on the community? Because everybody in the little town of Conway, South Carolina, where they were from, everybody knew them. They didn't call them by their name. They called them the twins or the boys. They knew them. They were flying airplanes when they were 15, 16, destined to be flying and flying together. So we're showing the reader, we're show don't tell. We're showing the reader what that's like and what it's like to have your heart ripped out and you don't know. And P.S., no cell phones, no internet service, no mail service, no international telephone service. And the only thing the government does, it's all it can do, the War Department. You get a Western Union telegram saying, regret to inform you, missing. Maybe it regret to inform you that they're dead. And now what? You get to wait. And if they were killed or lost in 42 or 43, you're going to wait years before you can find out anything. There's no one to ask. You can write all the letters you want to Washington. They're going in the waste bin. That's not what they're there in business to do, to console families. There wasn't anybody to console families. And that's the beauty of what the people in Margraten in the Netherlands understood. And they didn't understand it initially. The grave adoption program, you asked me the question, and I veered off course, but it starts organically. People knew soldiers. They did the decent thing like Frida did. They went and put flowers on it. And if they knew the names of the families or even had a clue, Frida, all she could remember was Hutchhausen went to Harvard. We'll write Harvard. And Harvard responded and gave her the information, and she wrote the mom. And that created a connection there. But in November 44, just after the cemetery's up and operational, like a couple of weeks, there's a guy named Captain Lane who's there to pay respects to his cousin, Captain Land, John Land, who's been killed. And he sees a civilian walking around the cemetery, the only guy that wasn't military. And he goes up to him, and the reason that guy was there was he happened to be a Dutch guy that spoke English fluently, Joseph van Laar. And he said, I got to move on. Any chance that you could watch over my cousin's grave? And Joseph van Laar said, I would be honored to watch over your cousin's grave. Indeed, I will adopt it. Now, he didn't mean adoption foundation. He just meant, figuratively speaking, yeah, I'll take care of it. Other soldiers saw the two of them talking. They thought, well, let's go talk to that guy and see what they're talking about. And they realized what was going on. And so they asked Joseph van Laar to watch over their buddies' graves. And he said, well, one after another he did. So January 45 rolls around a couple months later, and the Margrateners and people in Limburg, with this immense sense of guilt, trying to find an answer to the question, how do you thank your liberators when they're not alive to thank? So even while the war's going on, this isn't something like they waited till the war's over. There's still 5 more months. We don't know the outcome for sure. They're already trying to figure out, how do we say thank you? And Joseph van Laar's at this meeting of the town council in Margraten, and he says, well, I got an idea. I've promised so many soldiers that I'll watch over the graves of their friends. I can't possibly do it. And Mayor Ronkers, the mayor of Margraten, bang, that's it. We'll start a grave adoption program. So it starts really like a Lego set that my kids would be putting together piece by piece, nothing dramatic, not fast. They assign the responsibility to a young 32-year-old very provincial priest who doesn't speak English or much English, Father Hoytian, who does a really good job doing his provincial duties, but also finding people that will adopt a grave. And by the first Memorial Day, they have a couple hundred graves adopted, a couple hundred out of, they were at about 13 or 14,000 by the first Memorial Day. And then as the war ends and the two other cemeteries, temporary cemeteries in Netherlands, Molenhoek and Sonner, closed and consolidated, the numbers working towards 17,000. And by the second Memorial Day, May 46, they have all 17,800 graves adopted. So how did that happen? How did we go from onesies and twosies to almost 20,000? The answer is in the summer of 45, mail service resumes gradually. And Americans, being the entrepreneurial creatures we are, look at maps, and some of them can't find Margraten on the map, but they see Maastricht and they know the cemeteries, the American military cemeteries somewhere in the southeast. They start writing letters, Dear Mayor, mayors of any towns around there. And one letter comes through that arrives at the mayor's office in Maastricht, and it goes like this. I am a 22-year-old woman and I live in Demopolis, Alabama. My husband was killed on his 25th birthday. He was my everything. I would be beholding all the days of my life to you if you could send me a photograph of his grave. You know, we don't have to think as Americans back any further than COVID. How many people were saying, I never got a chance to say goodbye? I mean, they were trying to find something to grieve over. And the only realistic thing they could hope to get was a photograph of the grave. That was it. And the mayor handed it to his wife, Emily, and said, this looks like something you could do. And she took her two daughters out and took a photograph. Well, within a couple of months, more letters start arriving. And the importance of that is, and they're arriving in Maastricht, where Emily's husband works. They're arriving in Margraten, where Mayor Ronkers works. And all the letters pretty much read the same. And they realize at this stage, you know, it's a really noble thing that we're adopting these dead bodies and paying homage to them. But where the real need is, where we can take this thing and fulfill the maximum benefit it can provide, is to reach across the ocean into the homes and try and assuage the grief of these American families. If we can get the names of the next of kin and connect them with our adopters, the adopters can write them. And if they knew the boy, tell them about what they knew, what they saw the last time they were with him, share personal experiences, take photos of the grave. And that's where the program went from this small, provincial, well-intended and effective in the limited context to something that was much, much bigger. And that's when Emily Van Kestnik wrote President Truman in an effort to start this year-long effort on her part, now 80-year-long effort to get the names and addresses of the rest of the next of kin.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Conway boys. I just want to read a few sentences from your book. One of the things that you do so well is, and really, as you said there, the trauma of the people who are back home, who get a telegram and they don't know Europe. They'll never go to Europe. They don't know where their boy is. They don't know where he's buried, their husband. And you talk about the grief of the Norton mom and dad just trying to get their possessions back from the army. And one day, the delivery truck arrives a year or more after their death. And I just want to read this. The delivery truck finally arrived. Into the family room in Conway, the movers carried a 60-pound footlocker and a 37-pound barracks bag that had belonged to James, and a 103-pound locker and a 35-pound bag that had belonged to Edward. Boots, socks, pants, shirts, underwear, neckties, handkerchiefs, bath towels, service caps, swim trunks, hairbrush, whisk broom, flashlight, sewing kit, pencils, and personal mail. They were the same things a million soldiers and flyers carried, but fate had converted them into priceless objects. To cry over hair in a brush or a pair of socks, to hug them to your chest and feel the fabric tearing straight through to your soul, is to know that you loved and loved well, and now you've lost. And you realize as you read that was played out, as you said, hundreds of thousands of times across this country. And for a lot of people, that's all they would ever have are socks and a hairbrush and those kinds of things. And so, and it's hard for us to remember now with the communications that we have, and seemingly it's easier to text somebody in Holland now than it is to tie your shoe. And yet, these people brought comfort. And Emily actually got on an airplane and flew over here and put herself through a grueling tour, if you will, reaching out to people, telling the story of the cemetery there. And the story of the Norton boys is multiplied. You tell all of the stories of these boys and girls so well and so touchingly. And I'll tell you, as you read this book, if you don't have tears through most of it, you're not really paying attention. And the important thing is, Robert, as you point out, that this continues. This wasn't something that just what we call the greatest generation did. That the Dutch adopted these graves and passed them down to their children and to their children, and that this goes on. And in many cases, they've lost touch with these people. This is an ongoing effort, right?
Well, it is. And in fact, just a few days ago, the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, its charter is to raise awareness about the importance of preservation of cultural history, our shared cultural history. So the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, and this is, as I said, I don't just write books for the sake of writing a book. I have a message, and I have several messages here, but one of them is we entered into a joint venture with the Dutch Foundation for Adopting Graves, and the name of our joint venture is the Forever Promise Project. And we named it that because when Emily came to the United States and she traveled for 5 weeks, living with families who had lost a loved one overseas. Some weren't even buried in the Netherlands, but it was someone to talk to, and they didn't have anybody else. And she lived in their homes. She'd go to the next town. She started off in New York. She landed at LaGuardia Field in June 46. First time she'd ever been on an airplane. Left her 11 children behind, including her less than 1-year-old who was very sick. But she was determined to do this. If we can't get the information from the American officials, I'll go there. I'll talk about it. I'll try and bring as much visibility, and I'll try and just gather them by hand. And then she traveled to Washington. She met a young congressman from Texas named Lyndon Johnson, who knew a woman of destiny when he saw her and said, "Young lady, you need to go to Texas." And lo and behold, she starts off in my hometown, Dallas, Texas, in June 46. She's met by a couple of families that they're the adopters of their boys. She travels to Lockhart. She travels all across the Southeast, meets with many of the people that wrote her letters, goes to Atlanta, then all the way up the Eastern Seaboard. And for 5 weeks, she's absorbing the grief of these families. And she knows that it's going to be at least a couple years before there's any election notice from the government for them to decide whether to have their boys brought back or leave them there. And she knows it'll be another few years on top of that before they would have any chance of seeing their boy. And she understood. I mean, if ever a woman had a CV for grief, it's this mom of 11 children who's had 7 miscarriages, whose mom died giving birth to her, who said, "Every American boy I see in uniform, I can only see the face of my child." And she said to all of them, beseech them, especially the young war widows, "Leave your boys with us. We'll watch over them like our own forever." And the Dutch have done that for 80 years without cessation, 100% adoption. And yet they only have ever had about 20% of the names of the next of kin of American relatives. In some cases, people got letters from someone in the Netherlands and they threw them away. In most cases, the government wouldn't provide it. They never had the information. So the point of our Forever Promise Project is to finish the task, to fulfill the original vision of the founders and use the visibility of the book. And we have our last page in the book describes the Forever Promise Project. People can go to foreverpromise.org website, and there we have a searchable list of all 10,000 people that are buried there. And we ask people, go there, see if you have a relative. If you do, there's a short questionnaire that pops up. What's your connection to the relative? Are you aware there's an adoption program? Do you want to be connected to your adopter? Will you give us permission to convey your contact information with the Dutch adopters? So we can't get to 100% because there's some orphans, but we ought to be able to get into the high 80s, et cetera. And people want this connection. And it's just form over substance. We can do this now. I can't do it on my own. We need the public to get engaged. But it's doable, and it's doable in our lifetime. It's doable in a few years, and it's the right thing to do. And we're just so proud to be able to work with these people in the Netherlands. They have 1,000 people on the waiting list to become adopters.
Mm.
And because the turnover is only about 20 or 30 a year, that's it. So they take immense pride in being adopters and the connections they have with American families. And I'll tell you what, if if today, 2025 isn't the time we need to know this story about these historical friendships we've had that have been threaded together by the hands of time, the seamstress of time. This is it. And here's a chance to actually add to that and influence that. And it's a great privilege to be able to do it.
And I think it's really important that you also take the time in this book, painful reading that it is, but it is necessary reading, to describe how those bodies wound up in that cemetery. Um, Obviously, from the time American troops from the planes took off in England for D-Day, everyone knew there were going to be deaths, and soldiers have to be buried. Their bodies have to be retrieved from battlegrounds. They have to be retrieved from artillery explosions and grenade explosions and things that happen that are almost unspeakable to write about. But you do write about it, and you do not, as you and I spoke before this, and you don't dwell on it. It is not gratuitously graphic, but it is graphic enough to let the readers know that the job that this Graves registration group had was not one that it was not an easy job, but a necessary one. And you tell their story. These bodies just don't wind up in Margraten by accident because a farmer comes across something. These people went out and they found them. And I wanted to read this part. You said that the United States was intent on providing its fallen soldiers respect. The remains of every dead American, to the best of the Army's ability, would be recovered. The remains of every dead soldier would be identified. That no family was left without word of their fallen loved one. Every man or woman would be buried in their own grave under their own serial number and their own name, so that each would remain an individual, fallen in a global conflict, but honored and valued for the life they'd led. And this is the really important part. The U.S. Army reflected the beliefs of the society that produced it. That freedom and democracy, the ideals for which it was fighting, meant valuing every life. And I say that, Robert, and I read that in part because it seems as if, we're struggling with that right now, that there's a sense that we don't owe anybody anything. We don't have any obligation beyond our borders. And the American Army, and others have pointed this out, in World War II was different. This was an army of liberation. Americans were welcomed and remembered. But that's a long lead up to say, just talk for just a few minutes about the Graves registration, those people who had the job of finding those bodies.
Well, I made a comment to someone the other day and said, I truly believe these grave diggers and the grave registration officers that they had the worst job during the war. I mean, soldiers aren't entrepreneurs. They get assigned a task. So I think when we're talking about heroes, put an asterisk by it because that person didn't anymore get to choose to have the opportunity to be heroic than a guy who's digging graves chose to be digging graves. I mean, you got assigned what you got assigned, and your range of options is to perform that task as brilliantly as you can, even if it's the worst task in the world, or even if it involves shooting the bad guy. Um, they don't know how long they're going to be there digging graves, but as far as I know, they'll be there until the war's over, and no one knows when that's going to end. The monotony of it, the dealing with body parts. The dog tags were placed in the mouths. One dog tag was placed in the mouth of the body to make sure there was no risk ever that it would be misidentified. The other was nailed to the wooden cross or Star of David because they didn't have time to stencil names on them. Or and then they had to figure out solutions about, well, suppose there isn't a head. And we include a photograph in the book of a stick figure autopsy, like you've seen in, crime shows that they do a trace of where the body was, and with a red colored pencil on the autopsies, everything except the torso is red, and then below it is the form that they're doing this on that says everything that is colored red were the parts we didn't have. So this is the task, day after day in pouring rain, freezing cold, very dangerous because of live ammunition. A soldier comes in and he's rigor mortis with a live grenade in his hand. A soldier comes in and he's frozen with a live grenade in his hand. The grave registration officers are trying to remove every form of identification to make sure that those things are preserved for their family and later cleaned up. And then, aside from what's taking place with the burials, for several years after the war, the grave registration units comb every single foot of Europe, walking up to farmhouses to ask, did you see a parachute come down? Do you have any bodies of water on your place? Is there a pond? Is there a fish tank? Is there a well that a soldier could have fallen in that you don't know about? Did you bury anybody that you didn't tell about? And you can't read this book and not be filled with immense pride to be an American, to see the lengths that we went to as a country to honor that often spoken phrase about nobody gets left behind. Remember Us takes it that last remaining distance. It's great that we don't leave anybody behind, but if we forget about them, to what end? And Remember Us and the whole idea of this forever promise, completing the grave adoption program, has as its objective that we don't ever forget, that we do remember. And if that happens, then our deaths are not ours, they are yours. Give them their meaning. We will have done that. We will have answered Archibald's, McLeish's call to action many years later, but we'll have gotten it done. And that will be something that will confer great dignity on our nation and all those who help us get that done.
And I don't know if you timed it this way, but you and I are speaking, and this book's going to come out really at the beginning of the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the United States as we commemorate. Today happens to be April 18th. This is, of course, the night of Paul Revere. Tomorrow's the anniversary of the Battle of Lexington. And the message you have is really one, and I think you would agree with this, that transcends not just World War II, but any battle, any soldier. It's always about, I think, remembering that sacrifice and
Well,
the people.
Steven Spielberg's partner, Kathleen Kennedy Marshall, before I'd written Monuments Men, but I knew I was going to write it, and I was introduced to her, and she said, "What's your book going to be about?" And I said, "Well, it's a story about World War II, that," and she interrupts me, and she said, "What's your book about?" And I said, "Well, if you didn't interrupt me, I'll finish telling you." And she said, "Well, it can't be a book about World War II." And I said, "Well, it's my book. I think I know what it's about." And she said, "You can't do that." And I said, "Well, you produced Saving Private Ryan." And she said, "That's a good point. What do you think that's about?" And I said, "It's a story about World War II." And she said, "No, it's not." And I said, "Okay, well, it's your film. What is it about?" Four brothers, three dead, one missing. Go find them. And her point was World War II, it lasts 7 years. It claims 65 million lives. There's no place in the globe to go and hide from it. You can't write a book about that. That's the backdrop. And you are right. This story is set against a World War II backdrop, but it's a timeless and very timely story. I mean, this is what's going on in Ukraine today. And how we remember people, how we provide dignity to their lives, how we express our gratitude. And this is the challenge one of the challenges we as Americans are facing today. But I think it's where the battle's being fought. We have 335 million Americans in this country, and we only have 1.5 million people that are taking care and protecting and risking their lives to take care of those 335 million Americans. And we've set this up in such a way now, or it has evolved this way, either however you want to make the argument, that the 335 million Americans, unless you've got family in military, you don't have to care. You just don't have to care. It ain't my job, man. Oh, that's too bad. 4 guys sucked into a hole in Lithuania, 4 soldiers. That's too bad. What else? What's for dinner? And that's not right. And that's not the way it's ever been in this country. But that's how it is today. And the fact of the matter is, and part of the reason I'm so motivated to try and change this, and to the extent that one person can get things started, is that we're not teaching it in schools. And I didn't learn it in school. I learned it because I had a World War II veteran and parents who were Depression era kids that it was just imbued in us because it was in our home. We understood life of service, shared sacrifice, pick up the trash. I didn't drop it. I don't care whether you did or didn't. Pick it up. Turn the lights out when you leave the room. Don't waste. Wash aluminum foil. We thought these were stupid things when we heard them as kids. They didn't seem so stupid as we got older. We're not doing that today, and we're not going to have we don't have it easy. We don't have any World War II veterans or Depression era parents around to do it anymore. We have kids of those people, but it doesn't resonate the same way when we tell it as it did with the people that went through it. So if we're not going to teach it in school and they're not getting it at home, in a way, we shouldn't be mad at the 10-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds that don't understand that freedom's not free, because how would they know? But we got to change that. In my opinion, we have to change that. We change that, we transform our country. It's just that simple. I'm not saying it's easy to do, but it's not complicated to figure out.
At the end of your book, very well said. And at the end of your book, you end it asking people to perhaps think about, and this podcast is going to come out in May with Memorial Day just a few weeks ahead of us, that maybe this year on Memorial Day, in addition to the other things that you might do, go find a cemetery where there are veterans buried, where there are men and women who died for our country, and put a flag on that grave, because they too cry out, "Remember us." And that, what I think, is where we're going to end this. I cannot commend this book enough. Robert Edsel, the book is called Remember Us, American Sacrifice, Dutch Freedom, and a Forever Promise Forged in World War II. The publisher is Harper Horizon. This book is going to be out on April 29th. Robert, thank you for taking time to come on this podcast to tell this important story. I wish you continued good luck, not only with this book, but everything you're doing for our country and the people who served.
Thank you, Stan. Really appreciate your support.
My thanks to Robert Edsel for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at harpercollinsfocus.com and at robertedsel.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Krellin. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including now on YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone. And I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app. That would be most appreciated. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit the official Off the Beaten Path website at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com. And check out my videos, my blog, and similar podcasts about great books and the authors who write them, like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.